The word of the day is backstop. The Irish border, the biggest hurdle at a deadline summit on concluding terms of divorce between Britain and the rest of Europe. As a safeguard, in case there is no agreement in keeping the UK in the customs union on time, the European Union insisting the deal must keep the border open between the two Irelands. But the unionists who prop up Theresa May's minority government want no part, even in theory, of a border in the Irish Sea, even if it would be a one that was limited in time. Before the 1992 Good Friday Agreement, crossing into Northern Ireland meant traveling through a militarized zone. Would no deal, no backstop Brexit really mean a return to this? The standoff on this issue serves as a reminder of the reason Europe was founded in the first place, to make our economies interlinked so we wouldn't be at each other's throats. So, to make the most of baseball expressions, we're going to be asking about backstops and whatever curveballs await as European leaders face the prospect of extra innings in sealing this deal, not just at the summit, but in implementing a Brexit that's due to be ratified and underway in just 183 days. Today in the France 24 debate, we're wondering, for a Brexit deal, where do you draw the line? Joining us from London, Andrew Lillico, Executive Director of Europe Economics. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening.
We welcome back Yves Bertoncini, President of the advocacy group Mouvement Européen France, European Movement.
Good evening.
How are you?
Fine.
France 24's Douglas Herbert is here as well.
Am I just the pinch hitter tonight in this debate?
No, full disclosure, you should be using cricket analogies since you're also a British subject. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debates. Before all else, in case you're wondering, we're going to show it to you now. What a backstop is. The backstop is the screen behind a batting cage that prevents errant balls from hitting spectators. The term does come from cricket. It used to be a player's position on the field. A lot of people wondering about this word backstop, especially here in France, since they've been hearing it a lot over the past couple of weeks. In the case of Brexit, it's all about the backstop and where free movement of goods and people ends and where barriers begin.
That we cannot agree to anything that threatens the integrity of our United Kingdom.
For sure, the no-deal scenario is more likely than ever before. I am going to ask Prime Minister May whether she has concrete proposals on how to break the impasse. Only such proposals can determine if a breakthrough is possible.
Yves Bertoncini, this sticking point, the backstop, is there a solution?
Yes, the backstop proposed by the European Union is a solution, but apparently it's not acceptable by the British authorities. I can understand this, but I mean, the question is, where do you draw the line? If you don't want to draw a line, a border, meaning between Northern Ireland and Ireland, which is an automatic consequence of Brexit. Brexit is a democratic choice, but it has consequences. So if you don't want to draw such line, I mean, back to border controls, you need to invent something different from a pure hard Brexit. So the backstop means either we find a solution to avoid such control on goods and persons, or we say that Northern Ireland remains part of the single market and the customs union, more or less, so that there is a kind of status quo between the two islands, even if the consequence is that then the border checks could be organized between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom, which is, of course, very difficult to accept in London. So if they don't want to accept this, they can accept either the hard Brexit solution, meaning back to border control between the two islands, or proposing something different, alternative solution, so-called intelligent border control. But it's very difficult to understand what is the alternative proposal up until now. And that's why we are in kind of deadlock, at least for the next few days.
Andrew Lillico, is it binary? It's either you put a border between the two islands on land or a border in the Irish Sea?
Well, it's not I don't really accept that characterisation. Just to understand from the point of view of your viewers, suppose that the UK had said unless the Pays de Calais post-Brexit is subject to United Kingdom laws and United Kingdom regulations, and the United Kingdom makes its trade policy, and there are controls between the Pays de Calais and the rest of France, there'll be no deal. I don't think you'd find it terribly difficult to decide whether you were going to go for no deal or not. That's what's being proposed by the European Union in the case of Northern Ireland. A key part of United Kingdom territory, large part, is being claimed for EU law and not for UK law post-Brexit. It's just inconceivable that the United Kingdom can agree to that. In fact, the EU's proposition on a backstop runs absolutely contrary to what was agreed last December. So last December, there was a backstop agreement. The backstop agreement was that the whole United Kingdom would maintain alignment with, that means doing things in our own way but achieving the same goals, alignment with certain key regulations of the internal market and the customs union. So those were originally in the original drafts, early drafts of the backstop, simply transport and certain animal and plant health rules and the energy market. It was decided that there might be a few extra areas, so that was amplified to those areas of the internal market and customs union which were required to meet the requirements of the All-Ireland Economy North-South Cooperation, the 1998 agreement. But it was never understood by the British at that time that that was going to be much beyond those areas of transport, animal and health and animal and plant health and energy. And so this notion that we suddenly go from that, an all United Kingdom agreement, that the backstop would consist of us aligning our regulation in a few small areas with those of the EU, to the EU then saying, well, our version of the backstop is we're going to claim that our laws and our regulations and our trade policy will apply in Northern Ireland post-Brexit.
But Andrew, there's the Good Friday agreements.
Andrew,
there's the Good Friday agreements.
The Good Friday agreement is absolutely not that Northern Ireland becomes subject to EU laws and EU customs procedures post if the United Kingdom leaves the European Union. It's nothing to do with the.
It's about keeping the border
Belfast
open.
Agreement. It is not. The Belfast Agreement does not include any requirement to keep the border open against economic controls. All that the Northern Ireland Agreement says about the border is that there shouldn't be watchtowers erected. That is, you shouldn't have soldiers who are threatening to shoot people as they cross the border. That was what was agreed in the Northern Ireland Agreement. It was in the Belfast Agreement. It's entirely reasonable that the United Kingdom should seek, as we leave the Single Market and Customs Union, to keep as open, as soft a border with as few stop and check controls at the border as we can. And that was what we said we would do. Now, the United Kingdom says, for our part, we think that we don't need to have any controls at all and we can manage it without controls. The EU seems to think that it needs to have some controls at the actual border. So we've tried to minimise those by saying, well, 80% of those are controls on animals and plants. So we'll align our regulations with yours in those respects.
What do you think the motives are on the part of the European Union for insisting on this backstop?
I think that the European Union are basically working together with certain forces within the United Kingdom who would like to use the backstop as an instrument to try to leverage through UK commitments to continue to be in the single market and the customs union, because, as you know, we're quite divided on that question within the United Kingdom. And although they lost, there are certain people who want to cling on to as much of EU membership as they possibly can, and they see this as a means to do that. And the European Union has been happy to go along with them in that. Why wouldn't they? But that doesn't mean that that's anything which has been agreed to. Neither does it mean that when push comes to shove, the United Kingdom that there's any possibility that we can agree to allowing the EU to annex Northern Ireland. I think it's naively insulting as a proposition. And the fact that it's been maintained this long is utterly ridiculous.
All right, a couple of reactions, including the one of the Irish Prime Minister walking into this summit, saying, Leo Varadkar saying, there is merit in discussing a longer transition, but there is not an alternative to the Irish backstop.
What's interesting with the Irish border issue, we began this debate focusing specifically on the economic and trade issues in the Brexit talks when this issue comes up. And then you did bring up the Good Friday agreements, which is, the 9,000-pound elephant in the room. Now, Andrew's technically right. It's true that in the original agreements, and let's not forget, we're going back 20 years here.
To 1992.
Exactly, over 20 years. In the
1998.
1998, excuse me. Thank you.
In the original agreement, no, there was obviously no explicit provision to keep an open border, but you also have indisputably a reality that there is an Irish Sea between the British mainland and Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which share a common land mass. And there's also that geopolitical reality, which people on both sides of that very porous border, because as members of the European Union right now, trade and services and goods flow extremely freely with very few restrictions across that border. And the geopolitical reality is that people have gotten used to that setup. And even in Northern Ireland, with the exception of the very small fringe party, the DUP, that supports Theresa May in Parliament, a lot of people are in favor of Northern Ireland actually being able to, as closely as possible, maintain its current trade status within the European Union post-Brexit. And European leaders themselves, more and more, when you speak to them, they all mention Good Friday. There is all lurking in the back of their mind, and not too far back, Francois, a real fear that there could be a lot of instability, if not even a return to the type of violence you saw pre-Good Friday Agreement. Obviously, that's open to debate, but the fear is at least expressed by European leaders.
Yves Bertoncini, why has there been, we haven't heard any dissenting voices among the other 27 on this issue. Why is it that there's such unanimity among the 27 when it comes to this issue of the Good Friday agreements and the border between the two islands?
Well, simply for, let's say, pacifist reasons, but also more generally because, the EU is about interdependence. It's about free movement of people. It's about, making peoples coexisting peacefully. And of course, it's even more important in countries like Ireland, where there was a war, there were violence, of course, in the 70s, and then there was, at the end, the 70s, and of course, a bit later on. So there is this interest in keeping this stable and safe. The EU is seeing Ireland and the Irish peoples as collateral victims of the Brexit referendum, because once again, it's a democratic choice. But by the way, the Northern Irish, they had not voted in favor of Brexit. And in Ireland, they are in favor of remaining in the EU. And if they were asked the question, they would remain in the EU. And so if you want to align, keep this aligned, either you ask the Irish people to be aligned on the Northern Irish people and legislation, or you're simply compelled to ask the Northern Irish part to say, well, let's stay together, so let's keep on implementing the same norms. It would not be that difficult as regard customs union, customs arrangements. You can call it customs partnership, anything, because this is all about, custom duties. These are all about controls. You can control at the border. You can control when the goods is leaving the UK, when the good is leaving China. You can control elsewhere, let's say. But the problem is really about single market regulations. And the problem, and let's say it bluntly, it's a matter of trust. There is a trust deficit, because if there is a solution saying, well, we, the Brits, including in Northern Ireland, we are committed in aligning our regulations on the EU once. It's going to be the same. But are we that sure? Can we really trust this commitment? So do we need to control? And it's true to say that there are regulations as regards safety, health, animal health. And so can we trust? And if there is a problem of trust, then you need controls. You need border checks. And the border checks, either you organize them between the two islands, or you organize them between, in the Sea of Ireland, as you've said. Maybe it would be simpler, but it's a matter of principle. And
so come what may, there would be, at some point or another, a return of a hard border.
No, of border controls, which could be made lightly or not, which could be made because there were proposals.
So
on
could
this
there be border controls while still respecting the Good Friday agreements?
by the Brits on behalf of EU norms, implementing EU norms or common norms? You could find solutions, and I think the Europeans are ready to try and find solutions. But I mean, there's a problem of trust. There's a trust deficit, and there's an asymmetry as well, because I mean, the Europeans did not ask for the Brexit. Of course, they accept the Brexit. They see that the Brexit will have consequences. They try to find solution, but it's also up to the Brits to say what they can propose to build a consensus. And up until now, it's not reached. I think it's within reach, but it's not reached yet.
Andrew Lilico, have the British been coming up with a solution, at least behind the scenes?
Well, there's been various different things proposed by the British. The British have proposed various alternatives which were consistent with the agreed backstop from December 2017. So the British have made proposals which were all United Kingdom proposals, which was what the EU agreed in December 2017 would be the backstop. And if the EU didn't want that as the backstop in December 2017, it shouldn't have agreed it then. So the EU is the one that has moved away from the previous agreement here. The UK's proposals have been in line with the December agreement. In fact, in my view, and in the view of many people in the UK government's proposals go well beyond the December 2017 agreement in ways which are undesirable, and it would actually probably find it quite hard to get its version, which goes, because they go well beyond the December 2017 agreements, through in the UK. So, for example, there are some officials in the UK who appear to be willing to contemplate having a backstop of permanent membership of the customs union. That's not going to fly, because the whole point is that we're leaving the single market and the customs union, and we're seeking to maintain as soft a border as we can in the context of leaving those things. So it isn't an option to say, oh, well, we might not leave at all. I mean, that's just absurd. So if you're going to, it would be acceptable to us perhaps to stay in the customs union a little bit longer if that helps. So we've suggested the idea of maybe having some kind of extra time limit, or maybe you would have something which you said, well, we'd stay in for a little while and there'd be some kind of conditional break. So we'd be able to say, well, we've done our best, we've stayed in a bit longer, and now we're going to leave. So those kinds of things would be an option. There are other kinds of things. For example, I've proposed that the right way of thinking about things is what would happen at the Irish border in the event of no deal, because the EU has assured the Irish government that even in the event of no deal, there would be no hard border in Northern Ireland. Now, the way I expect that would work is the EU would impose controls where controls already exist between Ireland and the rest of the EU, namely in the Celtic Sea border between Ireland and France.
All right,
So
we're going to pick up on that point about seaports and how you dispatch goods after Brexit when we come back. We have to take a very quick break. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're speaking as EU leaders take part in an 11th hour summit. We don't know whether this is the last one before a Brexit deal is sealed. They don't have one yet. The German Chancellor saying they're only 90% of the way there. While that summit takes place in Brussels, we're talking with Andrew Lilico, Executive Director of Europe Economics, who joins us from London. Welcome back. Welcome back as well to Yves Bertoncini, President of the advocacy group European Movement France, Mouvement Européen France, and France 24's very own Douglas Herbert. Theresa May, where you put that border for her, it's a make or break issue. She has a minority government. She's propped up by the 10 members of parliament who hail from the unionist DUP party in Northern Ireland.
We cannot have a barrier between ourselves. There's nowhere in the world would you have a barrier internally, an international barrier within a country. You cannot have that, and therefore we have to make sure that the whole of the United Kingdom leaves the European Union together.
All right, the words of Arlene Foster there. For more, let's cross to correspondent Hervé Amoric. Hervé, where are you?
I'm on the Irish border. I'm where the checkpoints used to take place, where every lorry, used to be checked right here. And in fact, the customs building, you can just barely see behind me. It's getting dark here, but you can barely see it. And one of the one of the truck drivers here who just was talking to me 5 minutes ago, Noel Davis of McLaren and Morgan, was saying to me, we used to be checked here. I will never want to do this again and lose hours on that file of trucks here on this Irish checkpoint. And that's likely to happen. It could happen if there is a hard border. Now, obviously, no one wants that on the Irish side, on the Northern Irish side, in Great Britain. Nobody wants, or in the EU, nobody wants it. But the reality is, if there is no Brexit deal, well, there will have to be some regulatory checks at some point to make sure that agro-food products in particular coming into the EU through what is now going to be, and that's pretty sure, the European frontier. Well, somewhere will have to be regulatory check to make sure that products are definitely, certified to go into the EU. So that's the very question. But what people are saying over here, whether you interview politicians in the Republic of Ireland, again this morning, the Taoiseach, the Deputy Prime Minister, was saying, well, we could certainly have something like the transition period could be extended if the time is needed to find some form of agreement. North of the border, most people are saying as well that, everybody wants a deal. The problem that the conundrum remains, and it is a conundrum for Theresa May indeed, and for the EU as well, because whatever happens here is not just about customs. It is not just about economics. As Peter Sheridan, former Assistant Chief Constable in Northern Ireland, used to told me in an interview a couple of days ago, this border is about identity. Solving the conflict was solving the border, and this is how important it is. The Good Friday Agreement enabled solving this border and enabled people to be able to feel, those who want to feel Irish and want to feel close to Dublin here could be happy, and those who feel British and have an identity which is linked to the union with Great Britain can also feel that their identity was not threatened.
Just very briefly, because I want to get back to our panel. Just very briefly, Hervé. Are we overplaying it, or is the media over exaggerating when there's a risk of a return to the Troubles if ever there is a hard border?
Peter Sheridan, Assistant Chief Constable, was telling us a few days ago, and he, the head of police of now agrees with this. Just put one single camera on this border for surveillance, and you'll attract some form of terrorism. This, which had definitely, more or less disappeared in the last 10 years at least, may have an excuse to come back, because Northern Ireland is just, peace is still fragile over here. Northern Ireland is just coming out of conflict, and there are disagreements that just, could blow up again. Of course, no one, including, politicians on both sides, would want to return to the troubled past. No one wants that, and it's a violence, and those supporting violence here are completely marginal at the moment and have very little support within the community. But God knows what could happen if this fragile peace was just, questioned again.
Hervé Amorique reporting from the border between the two Irelands. Many thanks for joining us here in the France 24 debate. Andrew Lillico, your reaction when you heard Hervé there mentioning how the erection of a single camera could be seen as an act of hostility by some of the locals.
Well, that's not really right. I mean, there are already cameras at some places at the border. I'm sure that if there were additional cameras, then some people might seek to vandalise cameras. I don't think that petty vandalism should be the basis for deciding one's trade and international and regulatory policy for the next 40 years. So I think that's...
So there's no risk of a return to the Troubles?
No, I didn't say that there was no risk of return to the Troubles. I said that I think it is very plausible that you would get some petty vandalism with some attempt to erect the odd camera, but I don't think that that's the same kind of a thing as a return to the Troubles. I think that it's important to think through what would happen in terms of the management of the Irish border in the event of no deal. Because I think if you're thinking about what you get from a deal, it's best to think about the counterfactual. What would happen otherwise? What are you trying to improve upon? And I think if there were no deal, the likely scenario is something like this, that the EU would impose checks on goods where there are already checks on persons between France and Ireland on what I call the Celtic Sea border. The UK would have checks for animals and where they already exist. So there's already a pan-Irish regime for animal and plant health, or for live animals in particular, but you could have a broader animal and plant health regime which applied to the island of Ireland, and then the United Kingdom would impose some checks there. And that's about 80% of the checks that would otherwise occur across the Irish border. And then you would have a combination of whistleblowing and customs officials going and checking in people's factories and that kind of thing on the island of Ireland itself. If you had a Celtic Sea border set of checks, you would contain the issue of single market integrity to only those movements which occurred on the island of Ireland itself. You wouldn't, for example, have the concern that people would come from Bulgaria or Italy or Spain or wherever and move their goods up via the Northern Irish border into the United Kingdom, for example. So you would be able to contain the issue to only Ireland, and then once you had only the island of Ireland, then you would be able to use these other administrative schemes. So, as I say, customs officials, whistleblowing, auditing, trusted trader schemes. And then the other thing that could happen is, with the use of those Irish Sea and Celtic Sea borders, when people were reasonably friendly and things were getting along, I think the Northern Irish Assembly would feel inclined to align more and more of its regulations with those that were in Ireland. That would move more and more of the regulations to the Irish Sea border and away from the Celtic Sea border. I think that should be considered to be attractive to both nationalists and to unionists in Northern Ireland. It would be attractive to unionists because they would be getting to choose what happened, and it would only be Northern Ireland that did that. It would be attractive to nationalists because you would see greater and greater alignment over time between Northern Irish and Irish Republic regulations of various sorts, which they would find attractive. And I think that kind of common sense approach can be used to manage things here in the event of a deal. So I don't think it's very likely that you would move towards having any kind of hard border. There are 275 crossing points between Ireland and Northern Ireland. That's more than currently exists for the entire rest of the EU's land borders. So I think that the Irish are very unlikely to accept the EU imposing any hard border. If there were to be a hard border, however, just with that scenario, it wouldn't be the end of the world, right? So there used to be customs checks up until 1992. That used to happen. I think that we all want to try to avoid them if we can. I don't think that the UK is very likely to introduce them, but if the EU feels it has to introduce them, then in the end, that's going to be the EU's choice. So there's only so much that the British can seek to do, because we're leaving the single market and customs union, to stop the EU from imposing a hard border as a consequence of that. And in the end, that's going to be the EU's call.
Yves Bertoncini, too much at stake for both sides. You agree with Andrew Lillico? In the end, it'll work itself out?
What do you mean from both sides? I mean, the two parts of Ireland, or the
well, you could say all
and the EU. I mean, no. As regards the UK and the EU, of course, there's a lot at stake, but I mean, it's more for the UK. I mean, with all due respect, I mean, of course, a divorce has consequences. There are costs. I mean, it's part of the divorce, but let's say that the Brits would face half of the cost and the Europeans would face half of the cost as well, except that they would divide this half into 27. So it's I mean, the Brits are more exposed. And within this, of course, the Irish are more exposed to what could happen. And yes, of course, I agree, it would not be the end of the world. It would just be regressive. We would come back to the past, and maybe, by the way, it was an unavoidable consequences of this Brexit choice, and it should have been explained a bit more during the referendum campaign. That would be clearer. But I want to add, yes, maybe we can find this kind of innovative solution which have been described, as long as there is common goodwill from both sides.
All right, we'll have to see how that plays out. Another point that Andrew brought up, which is an important one, which is how you move goods from Ireland to the continent. And right now, most of them go through the UK. That's all going to change. And there's concern here in France. The presidents of coastal French regions expressing growing alarm. They're dead set against a deal from July, or a proposed deal that would shut their ports out of transport routes from Ireland. Instead, you would have the goods going straight over, for instance, to Rotterdam or to Zeebrugge. The European Commission had published this hand-drawn map during the discussions before the French ports were taken off the map. You see the down arrows pointing down on that one. So the French ports are concerned. Those French coastal regions, Brittany, Normandy, the north, their other concern is the cost of border controls. 30 million euros, claims the president of the Normandy region. And the mega traffic jams to come. Today takes 45 minutes to unload a ferry boat. With inspections, you might make that 3 hours. In Dieppe, where the region subsides the ferry to New Haven, the concern is real.
The line can only last if we continue to maintain a high level of freight. That is to say, the line on tourism alone is barely viable. In reality, it's freight that's responsible for the success of this line and its ability to maintain itself over time.
These fears that have been expressed, and we're hearing it a lot, Yves Bertoncini, on French radio the past week, by the presidents of the northern region, the Normandy region, talking of 27-kilometer traffic jams leading up to ports. Is that real?
Well, yes, this could happen if there is no deal or viable solution to avoid, not only with Ireland, by the way, but with the UK at large. If there is no solution, if there is no deal, if there is no arrangement to maintain a kind of regulatory alignment, and again, it's not about customs duties, which are very low, because these can be checked at source or at the origin of the product, but it's about regulatory arrangement. I mean, safety standards, because you can't play with this. So if there's no deal, or if there is an unsatisfactory deal, yes, there will be checks, and the checks will be made at the borders. There will be traffics going elsewhere, and that would be a destabilization, not only for both sides of Ireland, but also for, border regions such as Normandy.
There's another aspect to this, Douglas Herbert, and that is, of course, we don't know what's going to happen with those freight trucks.
Right.
We don't know what's going to happen with citizens. In particular, the several 100,000 UK citizens who live here in France, for instance.
Including a sizable part of France 24's newsroom, who are British citizens. No, there has been a complete sort of cloud of uncertainty hovering over this issue.
183 days to go to Britain.
It's remarkable in a sense, because with an issue, that is so important.
Do they apply for visas?
They're literally, it depends on, the answer depends on whom you ask right now. But I'll tell you this, there was emergency draft legislation, which was published originally earlier this month by the French Senate. And it was, and basically what it is it lays out a whole set of actions, emergency decrees, which the French government would be granted powers to pass over 12 months after Brexit, in order to cope with the consequences of Britain crashing out and there being no deal. And one of the sections among the many, it's a long, rambling document, one of the sections among many does deal with the status of British citizens in France. And when you read it, it starts to raise eyebrows, because he said 183 days. You'd have to reapply for visas. When you come into France, you'd need a visa now to enter French territory. If you intend to stay there, you'd need to apply for a residency permit known as a titre de séjour.
And is this in case of no?
This is in case of a no deal. Now,
of a no deal Brexit.
Clearly, a lot of people are still hoping that something will be hammered out at the last minute. There's nothing like a deadline breathing down your back to make minds, bring people together and come up with something. So there could still be reciprocity. But one of the things in this, Francois, I'll just point out, there are entire professions where if you're a British person exercising it in France, like a doctor, pharmacist, tobacco shop owner, you will no longer be allowed to exercise in France, because those are jobs only open to EU citizens. So there's a whole raft of nuances nuances and small fine print, which are going to mean a lot for a lot of people. You mentioned hundreds of thousands.
And which are going to have to be ironed
now.
out and fast. Which brings us back to the topic of the day. This was supposed to be on paper, Andrew Lilico. I hope you brought your crystal ball. This was supposed to be the last chance summit that's taking place right now in Brussels. We've heard mixed messages going into the dinner. The one hand, we had the French president saying it's now that we have to decide, and we heard the Austrian chancellor saying we'll have a deal within weeks, possibly months. So when will we have a deal, if we have a deal?
Well, so some of the leaks to the journalists were suggesting that the EU might call a no-deal summit in November. I think that some of the EU leaders are minded to do that. From the UK point of view, it would be better if there were to be a deal, but if the EU decides that there's going to be no deal, then we'll live with that. I think it's more likely, quite a lot more likely now than not, that there will be no deal. And I'd say that that's something like 60 to 70% likelihood. Within that, there's quite a high likelihood.
Why would there be no deal? Would the no deal come from the UK Parliament rejecting the agreement, or just from there not being an agreement at all?
Either of those. So I think that it's quite likely that there's no agreement at all, and it's quite likely that anything. Partly because all the deals which the UK government appears to be seeking to make would probably be rejected by the UK Parliament anyway. So it's quite likely that there would be a no deal. The only scenarios in which you get a deal are those in which the current government is overturned. And that's quite likely. It is quite likely, in fact, that Mrs May's government falls and that you get somebody else who tries something else. But
within 183 days?
Yes, I think that is quite likely.
Is it plausible? Can you change governments and complete the negotiation all in time?
As was just said, there's nothing like a deadline for concentrating minds. Though, as I say, I think the most likely scenario is that there's no deal. Within that, there's quite a high likelihood that we then cobble together some deal that's just enough to keep the show on the road, as it were, for a little while, almost immediately after March 29th. So you go right to the wire, then everybody sort of decides that they don't want to be going for more than a few weeks thereafter, and then you get some sort of very minimal deal cobbled together on a few minor questions, perhaps including some money, probably including nothing on the Northern Ireland border at all, maybe some sort of very vague commitment from the EU to seek to have no tariffs over the medium term. There's actually a requirement within the United Kingdom's EU Withdrawal Act that any deal with the EU can only be approved. We can only approve any kind of withdrawal agreement if it includes a future partnership agreement. So it's absolutely integral to there being any deal that there's some sort of future partnership.
Yves Bertoncini, you agree? 60 to 70% chance of no deal?
Well, I would be less pessimistic, let's say, and I would stress.
You're a glass half full kind of guy.
Yeah, and I would like to stress that what is at stake now is to have a divorce deal plus the transition period up until the end of 2020. And this is part of an agreement to be ratified by March 2019.
That's just wrong. I'm sorry, but that's just wrong.
And in addition to this, you need a political declaration on the future relation between the EU and the UK. But this political declaration can be more or less precise, more or less vague, should not be ratified as such. What has to be ratified as the divorce deal, including on Ireland, and the Holland border, the citizens, the payments, and the transition period. So I believe there is a common interest in reaching this deal, provided there is a solution found in the next few weeks. Normally, there should be the last chance summit in November, not this one, in November. It was already proposed by Donald Tusk after the Salzburg summit. Normally, including for the, let's say, the spectacle given, the impression, the grandstanding aspect, well, we are fighting hard. We including.
It has to go to the wire, and for you, the wire is November.
And then after, in November, maybe a deal, and of course it's at risk at the Parliament. But maybe last point, in Westminster, it's at risk. But maybe we may see, let's say, a coalition formed by people from the Conservative Party and the Labour Party able to ratify such deal.
Right,
Not
we'll
only,
see,
I mean, the majority, Theresa May's majority, which is very divided, including because it needs the support of the DUP.
The fault lines may shift. Lots still to come on this. Yves Bertoncini, I want to thank you. I want to thank Andrew Lilico in London. Douglas Herbert, stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to James Cretan.
Hi, Francois. I'm going to start with some cartoons because it's all very darkly humorous, this Brexit stuff, and cartoonists are definitely having a field day with it. Politico.eu, you have this cartoon here talking about the Theresa May's kamikaze Brexit, and what they're referring to here is, I suppose, the potential of a no deal or plane crash, and that the real deadline is, in fact, I suppose, December. The hardline Brexiters doing everything, I suppose, to avoid a soft landing there. So Theresa May in the
November,
cockpit.
You're saying December now, I see.
Oh, gosh, who knows what's going to happen. But in any case, the no soft landing just yet, according to that particular cartoonist. This is Steve Bell of The Guardian. My cabinet stand together is the byword there, but I suppose standing together on top of her being the message in that particular cartoon.
They said she wouldn't last weeks, and she's still in the job.
That's right, but she does look a little poorly there.
Yes, she does.
Underfoot. What else do we have? This is a cartoon that's doing around the social media. I suppose the clock ticking being the indication there. Wait, I have a cunning plan. But she's been caught in a pincer there between the hour and the minute hand. Elsewhere, we have Matt of The Telegraph. Brexit, the end isn't nigh, although it appears that reassurance that Armageddon isn't on the way is falling on deaf ears there, with lots of people scurrying off in all sorts of directions, looking somewhat upset and concerned. And moving now to Twitter, because it's not just cartoons, of course. This is a really interesting Twitter account called The Irish Border, giving a voice to that invisible border that is very present despite it being invisible, at Border Irish. And so this is kind of the pinned tweet on the top, if you like, referring to itself as the elephant in the room.
The others seem nonplussed.
There you go. The elephant in the room, and they're just kind of ignoring it. Okay. It waxes poetic and lyrical sometimes, as I suppose the Irish tend to do. Soft but not soft. Cross me but don't double cross me. Invisible but don't pretend you can't see me. So determined there to remain visible, the Irish border. Quite like that. Now, what else do we have? We have Brexit Shambles. That's another good Brexit Twitter account to follow. Hundreds of thousands of followers, I believe. We'll just leave this here. Now, they're not the only ones on Twitter drawing attention to this particular tweet today by Kate Hoey, who is a Labour MP of Vauxhall, who came up with this rather cunning plan to resolve the whole thing altogether. If a backstop is such a good idea, that's of course the idea that in the event of a no deal, specific rules would be put in place for Northern Ireland to avoid a border. So if a backstop is such a good idea to sort the border issue, why do we not go for a backstop around the entire British Isles? Then the Irish Republic can be part of it too. And she puts in our exit, freedom there, an account followed by about 421 people. So there doesn't seem to be a massive amount of support for the idea of Ireland following, oh, that's right, sorry, 3,000 followers. But it's not the most popular of ideas, and it did get a lot of people saying this is reviving the Oliver Cromwell solution for the Irish problem. He of course, Oliver Cromwell famously led a parliamentary invasion of Ireland and is very unpopular in the Irish history books. Right. In any case, others saying, people really didn't think that was a credible plan. In any case, clearly the Irish question, if you like, in this regard is preoccupying analysts across Europe. It's not just in the UK and Ireland. Comment le Brexit déstabilise l'Irlande du Nord.
How it's destabilising.
That's right, how it's destabilising Northern Ireland, and their correspondent seems to feel that this is not and could not surely go towards a no deal because this is in no one's interests. So that's their take on it. Quick look at the front page of the Irish Times today. Now, what they've done, Francois, is they've spoken to the mother of somebody who was shot dead along the border at a customs check back when there was actually a hard border prior to the peace talks. If Brexit brings the violence back, they will be younger and they will have no fear because they won't remember. So some people drawing attention to that front page saying, look, let's not downplay the importance and the seriousness of this issue. A slight note of humour to finish with, Francois. This is somebody projecting forward to what Brexit post-Brexit stamps might look like. I think that's been online for a while. But
I love this one.
There's a touch of sort of stateliness about it, but maybe turned on its head.
All right, James Creedon, many thanks. We're going to continue to follow those negotiations taking place in Brussels. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.